The orphanage burned that night, but not from accident. Little Sarah May watched through cracked windows as flames devoured her childhood, her innocence, her trust in humanity itself. Blood stained her torn dress, bruises painted her pale skin like a map of cruelty, and in her 8-year-old heart, something darker than fire began to grow. Years later, when the giant cowboy found her trembling in that saloon, she whispered words that would seal the fate of every man who had stolen pieces of her soul. Subscribe now to witness a vengeance so complete, it will redefine your understanding of justice. The giant cowboy's shadow fell across the saloon floor, like judgment itself, his weathered hands steady on the whiskey glass, as Sarah May's trembling voice cut through the smoky air. She was 23 now, but her eyes held the ancient pain of a child who had learned too early that monsters wore human faces and hid behind positions of trust. The scars on her wrists told stories that decent folk refused to hear. White lines against pale skin that mapped a geography of suffering no soul should ever navigate. When she spoke his name, Judge Cornelius Blackwood, the giant's jaw tightened with a fury that made the floorboards creak beneath his boots. This wasn't just another job for hire, this was a reckoning 15 years in the making, a debt written in blood and tears that demanded payment in full. The orphanage director had been the first to fall, found hanging from his own bell tower with a note pinned to his chest. For Sarah May. Now only 3 names remained on her list, 3 men who thought their wealth and position could shield them from the consequences of their cruelty. The giant cowboy, they called him Thunderjack for the way his voice rolled across the plains like storm clouds, had seen enough broken souls to recognize the particular darkness that lived behind Sarah May's green eyes. She wasn't seeking mere revenge. She was pursuing a cosmic balance, a restoration of order in a world that had failed her when she needed protection most. Her small hands shook as she counted out the gold coins, each piece representing months of saving, of planning, of nurturing the cold flame that had kept her alive through nights when death seemed like mercy. The saloon patrons gave them a wide berth, sensing the electricity that crackled between the unlikely pair, the towering man whose reputation for violence was matched only by his strange code of honor, and the fragile woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes. Thunderjack studied her face in the lamplight, seeing past the careful makeup that couldn't quite hide the faded bruises, past the expensive dress that couldn't erase the memory of torn orphanage rags. When he finally nodded his acceptance, Sarah May felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the iron bands that had squeezed her heart for so many years. The first target lived in a mansion on the hill, surrounded by gardens that bloomed with flowers bought by blood money and watered with the tears of forgotten children. Dr. Ezekiel Morrison had been the orphanage physician, the man who was supposed to heal their hurts, but instead had created wounds that would never fully close. Thunderjack watched the house for 3 days, learning the patterns of servants and guards, mapping the routes of escape, and the corners where shadows gathered thick as guilt. Sarah May waited in the hotel room, staring out the window at the mansion's lit windows, remembering the cold examination table and the doctor's hands that lingered too long in places they had no right to touch. She had been 7 years old the first time, too young to understand why her stomach hurt for days afterward, too frightened to tell anyone what happened behind the locked door of the medical wing. The other children had whispered warnings about Dr. Morrison, but the adults never listened, never cared enough to investigate the tears and the nightmares that followed his visits. Now 15 years later, Sarah May felt a grim satisfaction, knowing that his comfortable life was about to end in terror and pain. Thunderjack moved through the mansion like death itself, silent and inevitable, his massive frame somehow finding purchase in shadows that seemed too small to hide a man of his size. The guards fell without a sound, their necks snapped with the efficiency of a man who had learned killing in the war and perfected it on the frontier. Dr. Morrison was in his study, counting money by lamplight, his soft hands tallying profits from investments made possible by his position at the orphanage. When Thunderjack's shadow fell across the ledger, the doctor looked up with the irritated expression of a man accustomed to being obeyed, his mouth opening to deliver a sharp rebuke that died in his throat when he saw the giant's face. There was no mercy in those dark eyes, no possibility of negotiation or escape, only the cold certainty of judgment finally arrived. The doctor's hands began to shake as Thunderjack pulled out a photograph, Sarah May at 7 years old, her face already marked by the hollow look of a child who had learned that adults couldn't be trusted. "You remember her," Thunderjack said, his voice soft as a grave whisper, "because tonight she's going to watch you die." Ndoo. The screams that echoed from the mansion carried across the valley like the cries of all the children who had suffered in silence, a symphony of justice that made the night birds fall silent in their trees. Sarah May stood at the hotel window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass, feeling each of the doctor's cries like a balm on wounds that had festered for 15 years. She had dreamed of this moment through countless sleepless nights, imagining the fear in his eyes when he realized that his victims had grown up and learned to fight back. Thunderjack had promised her that the doctor would know why he was dying, would understand that every moment of agony was payment for the innocence he had stolen from children who trusted him to heal, not harm. When the mansion finally fell silent, Sarah May felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, a sense of safety, of protection, of knowing that someone had finally stood up for the little girl who had been too small and scared to defend herself. The first name was crossed off her list, written in blood and sealed with screams that would echo in her memory like a lullaby of justice. The giant cowboy returned to the hotel as dawn painted the sky the color of old blood, his clothes unmarked, but his eyes carrying the weight of necessary violence. He found Sarah May still standing at the window, her face serene for the first time since he'd met her. The tight lines around her mouth finally relaxed into something approaching peace. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to hear about the doctor's final moments or the creative ways Thunderjack had made him pay for 15 years of nightmares. It was enough to know that Dr. Morrison would never hurt another child, would never again use his position of trust to satisfy his twisted appetites. 2 names remained on her list: Judge Blackwood, who had covered up the abuse and silenced the few brave souls who tried to speak out, and Sheriff Dalton, who had returned runaway children to their tormentors for the price of a bottle and a blind eye. Subscribe now to witness the hunt continue, because some debts can only be paid in blood, and Sarah May's vengeance has only just begun. Sheriff Dalton's badge caught the morning light as he stumbled out of the saloon, his belly full of whiskey and his conscience long since drowned in amber liquid that burned less than the memories he tried to forget. 20 years of wearing the star had taught him that justice was a luxury poor folks couldn't afford, and that blind eyes and deaf ears paid better than honest work ever could. He had returned dozens of runaway children to the orphanage over the years, ignoring their tears and pleas, their desperate stories of abuse and terror that he dismissed as the lies of ungrateful brats who didn't appreciate the roof over their heads. The gold coins that Judge Blackwood slipped into his palm after each delivery had bought him a comfortable life, a fine house, and enough whiskey to drown the occasional pang of guilt that tried to surface in the dark hours before dawn. But now, as he walked the dusty streets of a town that had once respected his authority, Sheriff Dalton felt the weight of watching eyes and sensed that his past was finally catching up to him like a pack of wolves scenting blood on the wind. Thunderjack had been tracking the sheriff for 2 days, learning his routines and weaknesses, studying the man who had built his career on the suffering of children too small to fight back. The giant cowboy felt a particular hatred for Dalton. At least, Dr. Morrison had been driven by sick desires, but the sheriff's crimes were motivated by simple greed, making him somehow more contemptible than the others on Sarah May's list. From his position on the hotel balcony, Thunderjack watched as Dalton made his morning rounds, noting how the townspeople avoided eye contact, how mothers pulled their children closer when he passed, how even the saloon girls seemed nervous in his presence. The sheriff's reputation for taking liberties with women who couldn't afford to complain was well known, though never officially acknowledged. Another layer of corruption that had festered in the darkness of willful ignorance. Thunderjack's massive hands tightened on the balcony railing as he remembered Sarah May's description of the night she had tried to run away at age 9, only to be dragged back by Dalton's rough hands and delivered to Judge Blackwood's private chambers for a punishment that had left scars on her soul deeper than any physical wound. Sarah May sat in the hotel room below, her fingers tracing the faded marks on her wrists as she remembered the rope burns from that terrible night 15 years ago. She had been so small, so desperate to escape the nightmare that the orphanage had become, that she had tried to climb down from a second-story window using bed sheets tied together like the heroes in the adventure books she read by candlelight. The fall had broken her arm, but the pain of the bones snapping was nothing compared to the agony that followed when Sheriff Dalton found her crying in the alley behind the building. He had looked at her with disgust, as if her suffering was a personal inconvenience, and his grip on her good arm had been deliberately cruel as he dragged her back through the orphanage doors. "Ungrateful little bitch," he had muttered, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Don't know how good you got it here." The judge had been waiting in his office, his face a mask of cold fury that promised retribution for her attempted escape. That night had been the worst of her young life, a symphony of pain and humiliation that had taught her the futility of hoping for rescue from the very people who were supposed to protect her. The confrontation came at noon, when the sun hung overhead like a merciless eye and the streets emptied as if the townspeople sensed the approaching storm. Thunderjack stepped out of the hotel and into the dusty main street, his shadow stretching long and dark across the ground as Sheriff Dalton emerged from the jailhouse, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. The two men faced each other across 50 yards of packed earth, the silence broken only by the whisper of wind through the wooden buildings and the distant sound of a church bell tolling the hour. Dalton's eyes were bloodshot from the previous night's drinking, but his hand was steady as he sized up the giant cowboy who had been asking questions around town, stirring up old memories that were better left buried. "You're the one been causing trouble," Dalton called out, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years behind a badge, though it trembled slightly at the edges. "I'm placing you under arrest for disturbing the peace and threatening a lawman." "Later." Thunderjack's response was a smile that held no warmth, only the promise of violence that had been too long delayed. The gunfight lasted less than 10 seconds, but those moments stretched like eternity as Thunderjack's hand moved with the fluid grace of a man who had faced death so many times that it had become an old friend. Sheriff Dalton's draw was fast for a man his age, his Colt clearing leather with practiced ease, but Thunderjack's massive frame moved with surprising speed as he stepped aside and let the sheriff's bullet whistle harmlessly past his ear. The giant's own gun seemed to appear in his hand like magic, the barrel finding its target with the inevitability of gravity as he put 2 bullets center mass into Dalton's chest. The sheriff staggered backward, his badge catching the sunlight one last time before he collapsed in the dust, his blood seeping into the earth that had been watered by the tears of too many innocent children. As Dalton lay dying, Thunderjack knelt beside him and whispered Sarah May's name, watching as recognition and terror flickered in the sheriff's fading eyes. "She remembers everything," the giant said softly. "Every child you dragged back, every blind eye you turned, every coin you took for their suffering." Sheriff Dalton tried to speak, perhaps to offer some final justification or plea for mercy, but death claimed him before the words could form. The townspeople emerged from their hiding places like prairie dogs after a storm, gathering in small groups to stare at the sheriff's body and whisper among themselves about justice finally being served. Some of them remembered the children who had tried to run away over the years. the desperate souls who had been returned to their tormentors by a man who valued gold more than innocence. Thunderjack holstered his gun and walked back toward the hotel, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed in his wake, his mind already focused on the final name on Sarah May's list. Judge Cornelius Blackwood would be the hardest target, protected by wealth and political connections, surrounded by guards and legal barriers that had shielded him from consequences for decades. But Thunderjack had faced worse odds in his time, and the memory of Sarah May's tears was all the motivation he needed to see this hunt through to its bloody conclusion. Subscribe now to witness the final confrontation, because when a giant cowboy goes to war against corruption itself, the very foundations of power will tremble and fall. Judge Cornelius Blackwood's courthouse stood like a monument to corrupted justice, its white columns stained with the moral filth of decades spent perverting the law for personal gain and twisted pleasure. The man himself sat behind his massive oak desk, reviewing cases with the detached efficiency of someone who had long ago forgotten that his decisions affected real human lives, real suffering, real children who deserved protection instead of exploitation. His chambers were decorated with portraits of founding fathers and legal scholars, men who would have wept to see how their noble ideals had been twisted into tools of oppression by someone who wore their sacred robes like a costume. The irony wasn't lost on Thunderjack as he studied the building from across the street. This temple of justice had become the very heart of the corruption that had destroyed Sarah May's childhood and countless others. The judge's reputation for harsh sentences against the poor and lenient treatment of the wealthy was well known, but his private appetites were whispered about only in the darkest corners of the town's consciousness, spoken of in hushed tones by those who knew but lacked the courage or power to act. Sarah May stood at the hotel window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass, as she stared at the courthouse where her innocence had been finally and completely destroyed 15 years ago. She remembered being dragged into those chambers after her failed escape attempt, her broken arm throbbing with each heartbeat as Sheriff Dalton shoved her through the heavy wooden doors. Judge Blackwood had been waiting behind his desk, his pale eyes cold as winter frost as he studied her like a specimen in a jar, his thin lips curved in a smile that held no warmth or mercy. "So," he had said in that cultured voice that made his cruelty seem almost civilized, "little Sarah May thinks she can run away from her responsibilities." The punishment that followed had been methodical and thorough, designed not just to cause pain, but to break her spirit completely, to teach her that resistance was futile and that her suffering was entertainment for those with the power to inflict it. That night had been the death of hope in her young heart, the moment when she learned that the very people who were supposed to protect children were often the ones who hurt them most. Now, 15 years later, she felt a cold satisfaction knowing that Judge Blackwood's comfortable world was about to collapse around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. Thunderjack had spent 3 days studying the courthouse, mapping its entrances and exits, learning the schedules of guards and clerks, identifying the weak points in what appeared to be an impregnable fortress of legal authority. The judge was paranoid about his safety, surrounded by hired guns who had been chosen more for their willingness to ask no questions than for their actual skill with weapons. But paranoia born of guilt was different from the tactical awareness of a professional, and Thunderjack had fought enough battles to recognize the difference between real security and expensive theater. The guards were lazy and overconfident, accustomed to intimidating townspeople rather than facing genuine threats. Their weapons well maintained, but their reflexes dulled by years of easy living. Judge Blackwood's routine was predictable. He arrived at the courthouse each morning at precisely 9 o'clock, spent his days hearing cases and conducting private meetings, and left each evening at 6 to return to his mansion on the hill. But tonight would be different, because tonight Thunderjack would be waiting in those chambers, and the judge would finally face a jury that couldn't be bought or intimidated. The infiltration began at midnight, when the courthouse stood empty, except for a single night watchman who was more interested in his bottle than his duties. Thunderjack moved through the building like a shadow-given substance, his massive frame somehow finding silence in corridors that should have echoed with his footsteps. The locks on the judge's chambers were expensive, but not insurmountable, yielding to the giant's patient work with tools that had served him well in darker times and bloodier places. Inside, the room smelled of leather and old paper, of power exercised without conscience and justice perverted for personal gain. Thunderjack settled into the chair behind the judge's desk, his hands resting on the same surface where so many corrupt deals had been struck, so many innocent lives had been bartered away for gold and influence. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch him with accusing eyes, as if the founding fathers themselves were bearing witness to this moment of reckoning. When Judge Blackwood arrived the next morning, he would find his sanctuary transformed into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided, and the sentence was death. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky the color of old blood, as Judge Blackwood's carriage rolled up to the courthouse steps with its usual punctuality. The judge was a creature of habit, finding comfort in routine and predictability, never imagining that his very consistency would become a weapon in the hands of his enemies. He climbed the steps with the measured pace of a man who believed himself untouchable, protected by law and custom, and the willful blindness of a society that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. His key turned in the lock of his chambers, with the familiar click that had marked the beginning of countless days of corrupted justice. But today, that sound was the tolling of a funeral bell. Thunderjack was waiting in the shadows behind the door, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm, his dark eyes reflecting the cold fury of every child who had suffered at the judge's hands. When Blackwood stepped across the threshold, he walked into his own execution chamber, though he wouldn't realize it until the door closed behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. "Good morning, Your Honor," Thunderjack said, his voice soft as a grave whisper. Court is now in session. The terror in Judge Blackwood's eyes was immediate and complete, the mask of civilized authority crumbling to reveal the coward beneath as he recognized the giant cowboy who had been hunting his associates with methodical precision. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his pale hands trembling as he reached for the bell that would summon his guards, only to find Thunderjack's massive fist closing around his wrist with crushing force. "Sarah May sends her regards," the giant said, producing the same photograph he had shown Dr. Morrison, a 7-year-old girl with hollow eyes and a broken spirit, a child who had been failed by every adult who should have protected her. Judge Blackwood's face went white as he stared at the image, memory flooding back like a tide of guilt and shame that he had spent 15 years trying to forget. "You remember her," Thunderjack continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment, "because today she's going to watch you pay for every moment of pain you caused her, every night of terror, every tear you made her shed." The judge tried to speak, to offer bribes or threats or pleas for mercy, but Thunderjack's other hand closed around his throat, cutting off his words and his breath, with the inexorable pressure of justice finally served. Subscribe now to witness the final moments of a monster's reckoning, because some sins are too great for any earthly court to judge. The screams that echoed from the courthouse chambers carried across the town like the cries of every child who had ever suffered in silence, a symphony of justice that made the morning birds fall quiet in their trees and sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. Sarah May stood at the hotel window, her face serene as she listened to the sounds of Judge Blackwood's final moments, feeling each cry like a balm on wounds that had festered for 15 years in the darkness of her soul. She had dreamed of this moment through countless sleepless nights, imagining the terror in his eyes when he realized that his victims had grown up and learned to fight back, that the little girl he had broken had found a champion who would make him pay for every moment of stolen innocence. Thunderjack had promised her that the judge would know why he was dying, would understand that every second of agony was payment for the trust he had violated and the children he had destroyed. When the courthouse finally fell silent, Sarah May felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, a sense of completion, of cosmic balance restored, of knowing that the monsters who had haunted her dreams would never hurt another soul. Thunderjack emerged from the courthouse as the sun reached its zenith, his clothes unmarked, but his eyes carrying the weight of necessary violence and the satisfaction of a job completed with brutal efficiency. The townspeople gathered in small groups along the street, their faces showing a mixture of fear and relief as they realized that the corruption that had poisoned their community for decades had finally been cut out like a cancer. Some of them remembered the children who had disappeared over the years, the desperate souls who had tried to speak out, only to be silenced by a system that valued order over justice, profit over protection. The judge's guards lay scattered throughout the courthouse like broken dolls, their expensive weapons useless against a man who had learned killing in the crucible of war and perfected it in the harsh justice of the frontier. Thunderjack walked through the crowd with the measured pace of a man who had completed a sacred duty, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed in his wake, his mind already turning toward the future and the woman who had hired him to balance the scales of justice. Sarah May was waiting for him in the hotel room, her face transformed by a peace that made her look younger than her 23 years. The tight lines of pain and anger finally smoothed away by the knowledge that her tormentors would never hurt another child. She had bathed and dressed in a simple white dress that made her look almost ethereal, like an angel who had finally found her way home after wandering lost in the darkness for too long. The list that had consumed her thoughts for 15 years lay on the table, all 3 names crossed out in red ink that looked like blood in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Dr. Morrison, Sheriff Dalton, and Judge Blackwood, the unholy trinity who had turned her childhood into a nightmare, were all dead. Their reign of terror ended by the giant cowboy who had become the instrument of her vengeance. "It's finished," she said simply, her voice carrying a note of wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe that the burden she had carried for so long had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Thunderjack nodded, understanding that this moment marked not just the end of a hunt, but the beginning of a new life for the woman who had hired him to right the wrongs of the past. The giant cowboy studied Sarah May's face in the golden afternoon light, seeing past the scars and shadows to the strength that had kept her alive through years of suffering and planning. She was beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with the indomitable spirit that had refused to be broken by the cruelty of those who should have protected her. "What will you do now?" he asked, his deep voice gentle as he recognized the crossroads where she stood, the moment when vengeance transformed into something else, something that might lead to healing or to a different kind of darkness. Sarah May smiled then, the first genuine expression of joy he had seen from her, and in that smile he glimpsed the child she might have been if the world had been kinder, if the adults in her life had chosen protection over profit, love over exploitation. "I'm going to help other children," she said, her voice strong with newfound purpose. "Make sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else." The gold she had saved for this hunt would become the foundation of something better, a sanctuary where broken children could find safety and healing instead of more pain. Thunderjack felt something shift in his own chest as he looked at this remarkable woman, who had transformed her suffering into a force for good, who had chosen to break the cycle of violence rather than perpetuate it. He had spent years as an instrument of death, his guns speaking the only language that men like Judge Blackwood understood, but Sarah May's courage inspired him to consider a different path. "You'll need protection," he said, thinking of all the other corrupt officials and predators who would see her mission as a threat to their comfortable arrangements, who would try to silence her before she could expose their crimes. "I know," she replied, her green eyes meeting his with a trust that humbled him. "That's why I'm hoping you'll stay." The offer hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning the gap between their violent past and a future that might hold something resembling peace. Outside, the town was already beginning to change as news of the judge's death spread, as people who had lived in fear for decades began to speak openly about the corruption that had poisoned their community for so long. As the sun set over the courthouse where justice had finally been served, Sarah May and Thunderjack stood together at the hotel window, watching the townspeople emerge from their homes and businesses like flowers blooming after a long winter. Children played in the streets without the shadow of fear that had haunted them for so long, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze like a promise of better days to come. The orphanage would be rebuilt, but this time with proper oversight and genuine care for the children in its charge, funded by the gold that Judge Blackwood had accumulated through his years of corruption. Sarah May's hand found Thunderjack's, her small fingers intertwining with his massive ones in a gesture that spoke of partnership rather than dependence, of two damaged souls who had found healing in each other's strength. The hunt was over, but their real work was just beginning. The long, difficult task of building something beautiful from the ashes of something terrible. Subscribe now to follow their journey from vengeance to redemption, because sometimes the greatest victory isn't in destroying your enemies, but in making sure they can never create new victims. The scales of justice have been balanced, but will Sarah May and Thunderjack's mission to protect other children lead them into even greater dangers? Subscribe to discover if their partnership can survive the forces that will try to stop them from exposing the truth.